5 years ago, after David proposed to me, he turned around and married the popular actress who had bullied me. The overwhelming news of their wedding sent shockwaves through my heart, and I left without a word. Now, 5 years later, he has returned, as promised, claiming he is divorced and ready to marry me. But my child is already 4 years old, so who truly kept their promise? The day I saw David again, I was working at the checkout counter in a supermarket. With the spring festival approaching, the store was packed, and I was too busy to even look up. It was only when I overheard customers talking about Cora's marriage troubles that I paused for a moment. Cora, David's wife. A national sensation, she married young at 20, and her romance had been a fairy tale for the public. Her marriage strengthened her career, and her online posts about love captivated countless fans. The media is just making things up, a girl scoffed. Cora and Mr. David could never get divorced. Another person held up their phone, showing an official notice from Cora's studio. Even in this remote city, their news had reached me. Yet, upon hearing of their divorce, I felt nothing, no joy, no resentment. Time is a strange thing. I no longer hated Cora. What had I even hated about her? That she bullied me? That I lost sight in one eye because of her? That she married David? None of it mattered anymore. In Cora's story, she and David endured countless hardships to be together. But what the world didn't know was that I was those countless hardships. It was ironic. My name really is Camila. Just as I was lost in thought, I saw him. David. He rushed toward me, his presence impossible to ignore. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but the strength of his grip on my wrist forced me to accept the truth. Gasps erupted around us. Oh my God, is that David? He's even more handsome in person. David stood tall, nearly 6'3", broad shoulders, a model-like figure. Even in rags, he would have drawn attention. Being a public figure, it wasn't surprising that people recognized him. As phones began to rise, I quickly lowered my head and pulled my hand away. Sir, please proceed to checkout, I said coldly. If there's an issue with my service, please contact the manager. David's voice carried a trace of urgency. Camila, do we really have to do this? Why are you hiding so far away? I've been looking for you for so long. I almost missed our appointment. Appointment? Who had an appointment with him? I remembered the promises he made under the starry sky by the sea. He had sworn to love only me for a lifetime. His eyes had burned with sincerity, warming my heart. Yet, in the blink of an eye, he was caught in an intimate embrace with Cora, their wedding live-streamed for the world to see. I had watched their vows standing in the rain, the whole world celebrating their love while my own world crumbled. 5 years later, while packing, I found a note he had hidden away. Camila, wait for me for 5 years. Back then, the gap between us was vast. I had loved him but never dared to believe I could have him. Yet, he had come to me, step by step, making promises, only to shatter them in the cruelest way. Now, I had my own life, my own family. I was no longer that foolish girl who would throw herself at the slightest warmth. I met David when I was young. I wasn't even sure of my exact age. He was 13, and I had been taken in by an old woman in the village who believed I was the granddaughter her missing son had abandoned. But the villagers never accepted me. They called me a wild child. My grandmother raised me for 10 years, and after she passed, my aunt came to the funeral and only then learned of my existence. She left afterward, and I lived alone in the old courtyard. In those days, I often thought about following my grandmother into the afterlife, but hunger always pulled me back. My aunt eventually returned, just in time to catch me stuffing a handful of dirt into my mouth. That was how I ended up with the Shen family. Madame Shen had a soft heart. Upon hearing my story, she allowed me to stay in the nanny's quarters with my aunt, as long as I didn't cause trouble. As I followed my aunt into their home, I saw him for the first time. David. He looked like a delicate porcelain doll, his dark eyes deep and unreadable, his skin pale and smooth, dressed in expensive clothes that stood in stark contrast to my own dirt-streaked appearance. People are drawn to beauty. I was no exception. I fell in love at first sight. But David didn't like me. In fact, he pushed me down the stairs within minutes of my arrival. I had barely been in the Shen household for a quarter of an hour before I was rushed to the hospital. My left eye was damaged, permanently. Though I could still see, it was never the same again. And yet, despite everything, I had loved him. Now, standing before him once more, I realized that the girl who had once loved him with all her heart no longer existed. 5 years had passed, and I had moved on. David, however, had finally returned, only to find that it was far too late. Mrs. Shin's guilt was evident when the doctor revealed that my body was covered in bruises and that I was severely malnourished. Meanwhile, her son had blinded someone. As for why David pushed me, well, that's a long story. The Shin family is one of the top aristocratic families, all thanks to David's grandfather, Shenu, who had built the family's fortune. But, like in every powerful family, there were bound to be black sheep. In the Shin household, that was David's father, Shin Masu. Even after marrying and having children, he continued to entertain mistresses, one after another. Yet somehow, it never caused any major scandals, until just before I arrived. A woman had shown up at the Shin residence with a 12-year-old boy, claiming that he was Shin Masu's son. Madame Shin fainted on the spot from the shock. The woman cried, saying she had no intention of entering the Shin family or seeking wealth, only that she wanted the child to be recognized. In the end, Grandpa Shenu stepped in to handle the situation. Later, someone gave David a harsh lesson about what had happened, and after that, he took matters into his own hands. And then somehow, I ended up being the one to suffer. At that time, I was thin, small, and androgynous in appearance, making it difficult to distinguish my gender. David assumed I was another illegitimate child and pushed me away. Only later did I learn that it was Cora's idea, because the heir to the Shin family could not have a sibling with a disability. Now, years later, I saw David again, this time on the stairs outside my home. He was nothing like the boy he once was. The innocence he had once carried was long gone. Now, he stood there, leaning against the stair railing, exuding the presence of a mature man. Dressed in a tailored suit and polished leather shoes, he looked out of place in this neighborhood. I ignored him and walked past, but he didn't leave immediately. Instead, noticing the growing number of onlookers, he eventually turned and walked away. I hadn't expected him to find out where I lived, yet here he was. When I returned home, his eyes lit up, and he walked toward me, arms outstretched, as if to embrace me. The stairwell was crowded, making it difficult to maneuver around him, and I didn't pull away in time. He took advantage of that, holding me tightly. "Camila, I missed you so much," he murmured in a playful tone. I remained tense in his embrace, and he tightened his hold even more. Even through my thick down jacket, I could feel the icy chill radiating from his body. He deserved it. Standing outside in freezing temperatures with only a thin windbreaker while the Lunar New Year approached. David had always been afraid of the cold, which was why he preferred to live in southern cities. I, on the other hand, hated the heat, which was why I had chosen to settle in this small northern town. Steadying myself, I pushed him away. His expression froze. This was the first time I had ever done that to him. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the security door behind him swung open. A small, delicate voice called out, "Mom, I heard your footsteps coming back." David's entire face darkened, his body visibly unsteady as he leaned against the wall for support. Then, another voice followed, deep, warm, and familiar. "Honey, come in quickly and try the dishes I just made." A tall man wearing an apron stepped out, spatula in hand. David's face, once the epitome of elegance and refinement, now looked as if it had been crumpled beyond recognition. Before my husband could ask anything, I brushed past David, took my daughter's small hand in mine and pushed my husband back inside. Smiling, I asked, "What did you cook?" My husband glanced back at David briefly before closing the door behind us. Then he answered with a grin, "Your favorite, mapo tofu." As the door shut, the stairwell was plunged into darkness. David stood alone, his thin silhouette barely visible. He remained there for a long time, staring at the closed door as if he could burn a hole through it with his gaze. For a moment, he raised his hand as if to knock, but then hesitated, letting it drop. Even in the freezing cold, he stayed outside my door for an hour before finally leaving. I saw it later on the surveillance footage. Though I no longer had ties to him, the Shin family had raised me. I couldn't let him freeze to death on my doorstep. Besides, my aunt had once saved David's life at the cost of her own. After my injuries from being pushed down the stairs healed, Mrs. Shin had felt guilty and arranged for me to attend the same school as David. But that was a long time ago. David had wanted to apologize to me many times, but in the end, he never said a word. Instead, he chose to help me in other ways. Living in the Shin family was never truly living. It was more like existing under constant scrutiny. Walking to and from school every day with David, the center of attention, only made things worse. At some point, everyone knew me as the wild child living in the Shin family. They whispered behind my back, accusing me of deliberately falling just to frame them. Some even boldly covered my right eye and stole my belongings, as if I didn't deserve to see or own anything. I ignored them. It meant nothing to me. I had long since grown used to being insulted, but David didn't ignore it. He beat up those who tormented me. When I found out, I sincerely thanked him. Growing up, there were kind people in the village who helped me and my grandmother. She had always taught me to be polite and to thank those who treated me well. David's face turned completely red when he heard me. He stared at me with his dark eyes for a long time before blurting out, "Who said I did it for you?" Not long after, trouble came knocking. Hitting people is always wrong, and the ones David fought weren't just ordinary students. Some were from powerful families, business partners of the Shins, or members of the nobility. Old Master Shin sighed deeply when he realized that the trouble had started because of me. After that, Mrs. Shin began making plans. She decided we couldn't continue living like this. She planned to quit her job after school ended and move away with me. She even talked about enrolling me in a school in the city and renting a house with a separate bedroom for me. But then, something unexpected happened. That day, a woman burst into the Shin residence, wielding a knife, and lunged straight at David. My aunt was there. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, pushing David out of the way, only to be stabbed herself. The woman pulled the knife from my aunt's body and was about to stab David again when 2 security guards arrived, tackling her to the ground. That woman. She was the same one who had come to the Shins with her son years ago. Later, she admitted she didn't want to kill David, only to leave him with a disability. That way, the Shin family would consider her son as an heir. But she didn't. Just take David's future. She took my aunt's life. That day, Mrs. Shin held me tightly and swore, "Camila, from now on, I will be your mother. I will take good care of you in her place." After David left, I pulled out my phone and dialed Mrs. Shin's number. The moment the call connected, Her anxious voice rang through the receiver. "David, is that you? Hurry home. Don't cause any more trouble." "Madam Shin, it's me. Camila." There was a pause. Then, her voice turned cold. "Camila? Why are you calling me all of a sudden? Did you contact David? Is that why he's missing? Again? It's been so many years. Can't you just let him go? I'm begging you. For the sake of all those years I raised you." I took a deep breath, gripping the phone tightly. "Auntie, I saw David in CIDF. You should send someone to find him." Before she could respond, I hung up. There were so many things I wanted to say to her, yet at the same time, I felt there was no need. Ever since the day she found out that David liked me, she had made up her mind. I was nothing but a scheming little hussy trying to seduce her son. But in my heart, I had truly regarded her as my mother. When my aunt died, I was plunged into loneliness, as if I had returned to that broken-down old courtyard where I had once lived. Back then, someone had come to take me away from that place, but this time, no one would come. Mrs. Shin had knocked on my door once, telling me she wanted to take care of me and be my mother. I had a grandmother. I had an aunt. But I never had a mother. I loved her. I truly did. Until the day David confessed his feelings for me. That was when I saw it. That look of disgust on her face. A look I had never seen before. It wasn't that Mrs. Shin intended to be cruel, but the way she looked at me, like I was dirt stuck to her golden sun, was enough to make my stomach twist. She asked David almost curiously when he started to like me, as if she needed to figure out the exact moment I had somehow seduced him. I had no answer. I didn't know when it happened either. I didn't even know why David liked me. I had never dared to ask. After my aunt's death, I didn't see David at all during the holiday. When I finally saw him again, his once fair skin had tanned to a healthier tone, and he looked stronger, more mature. I had heard that he had gone to his grandfather, begging for permission to leave and gain experience. He had said he didn't want to be the kind of person who always needed to be saved. Later, he really did save me. At school, a group of girls cornered me in the bathroom, taking turns slapping my face. "Do you still dare to seduce someone?" one sneered. "Would a blind person really like David?" another taunted. I had already stopped struggling when David appeared. Without a word, he lifted a bucket of dirty water and splashed it on them. Then, grabbing my arm, he pulled me out of there. I wanted to go back to class, but he stopped me. "Like this?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. Before I could argue, he dragged me to the infirmary. He carefully cleaned the wounds on my face, his touch gentler than I had ever expected. But then, suddenly, the sound of the teacher returning made me panic. Without thinking, I pulled David under the bed with me. We stayed there quiet. There was space between us, but when I turned my head to look at him, I noticed his neck and ears were flushed red. The truth was, I wasn't hiding because of David. I was hiding because I didn't want the teacher to see my injuries. I didn't want to worry Mrs. Shin. After school, as I got on the bus, David handed me a small bag. Inside, there was a mask and some anti-swelling medication. A few days later, he brought Cora to apologize to me. It turned out that she was the one who had spread rumors about my background and instigated the bullying. It was obvious. She liked David. Or maybe she had just decided that David belonged to her. She was bright and passionate, never hesitating to prove her love for him. She had driven away every girl who got too close to him. Back then, she was like a star. Beautiful, radiant, impossible to ignore. Isn't it just a little scuffle? Isn't she doing fine now? She pouted, trying to act cute to escape blame. But David didn't budge. His attitude was firm, and she had no choice but to mutter a half-hearted, "Sorry." Still, I saw no remorse in her eyes. After she said it, she turned to me, smiling. But her eyes? Those eyes were filled with contempt. Under her gaze, a deep sense of shame welled up in me, as if I had nowhere to hide. Later, I would come to understand that feeling. Inferiority. She was dazzling, beautiful, confident, surrounded by family and friends. And David. Seeing my reaction, she laughed even more freely. And then, suddenly, I wasn't in the school hallway anymore. I was dreaming. Cora's clothes had changed into a wedding dress. David was no longer distant. He was smiling at her, linking their arms together. Then, the two of them turned to me and laughed. The nausea hit me hard. I woke up, breathless. It had been a long time since I last had this dream. Maybe because I had seen David again. Sensing my unease, Grayson wrapped his arms around me from behind, holding me gently, soothing me. I let the warmth of his embrace lull me back to sleep. When I woke up again, the space beside me was empty. Grayson had already taken our daughter to kindergarten. After eating the breakfast he had left for me, I cleaned up and got ready for work. But when I arrived at the supermarket, something felt off. Everyone was looking at me strangely. Then, the manager approached, looking awkward. "Camila, there's nothing I can do," he sighed. "Someone reported to headquarters that your eyes are affecting your work. We have no choice but to dismiss you." When I first started this job, I never hid my eye condition. It never affected my work. But I didn't want to make things difficult for the manager. This job wasn't important to me anyway. As I packed my things, I heard my colleagues whispering behind me. "She actually became a mistress behind his back. She looks just like a vixen." I ignored them, left the supermarket, and stepped outside. As soon as I unlocked my phone, a gossip alert popped up. Is Cora's marriage falling apart due to a third party's interference? The attached photo showed David pulling me along in the supermarket yesterday. I sighed, lowering my phone. Before I could process anything, a group of people suddenly surrounded me. "Miss Camila, please come with us to meet Mrs. Shin." It was phrased as a request, but the way they boxed me in made it clear I had no choice. I glanced at them. A few of them were unmistakably Mrs. Shin's bodyguards. I got into the car, and we drove away from the busy city. The further we went, the more desolate the surroundings became. A nagging unease crept into my chest. Finally, we arrived at a villa. The house was large, but once inside, it wasn't as extravagant as I had expected. Instead, it felt warm and inviting, almost homey. Surely, nothing too dramatic would happen in such a cozy place, right? The television was playing my favorite show. The table was set with all the snacks I used to love. I hesitated at the doorway before tentatively calling out, "Madam Shin?" Was she trying to play the sympathy card? I exhaled sharply. Please don't. That was the last thing I wanted to deal with. Just then, a head peeked out from the kitchen. David. He was wearing an apron, a spatula in hand, still fiddling with some vegetables. When he saw me, his face lit up. "You're back. The food will be ready soon." I stood frozen, confusion swirling in my mind. What the hell was he doing? Soon enough, he skillfully brought out several dishes, arranged them on the table, and set the bowls and chopsticks. Then, as if this were all completely normal, he turned to me and said, "Why are you just standing there? Come eat." I didn't move an inch. "David, you should go home," I said, slow and firm. But he ignored me, stepping closer, his movements light and cheerful. Taking my hand, he pulled me to the table. "You have to try this fish. It's really fresh." I barely glanced at it before I bolted to the trash can and threw up. David followed, gently patting my back. Then he handed me a tissue, carefully dabbing the corners of my lips. David, I breathed out, steadying myself. I don't eat fish. Sitting up straight, I took a deep breath before continuing. I don't like fish. I never eat fish. Memories surfaced, ones I tried to bury. Back in the village, during the worst days of hunger, I had found a dead fish by the river. I didn't know how to prepare it, but I ate it anyway. The consequences had been terrible. From that moment on, I never wanted to eat fish again. And yet, there was a time when I had spent half a year cooking fish for David. It was a ridiculous period. After David graduated, the Shin family arranged for him and Cora to get engaged. David was furious, clashing with his family over it. Mrs. Shin, as always, tried to use me. You young people always have things to talk about, she had said. Can't you help your aunt and ask? I couldn't refuse. So I went to David's room and asked him directly. Why was he so against marrying Cora? He stared at me with those deep, dark eyes. A long silence stretched between us before he finally spoke. You really don't know why? I felt my face heat up. I didn't know if I should know or not. I like you. Can you tell Mom that's the reason? I heard a noise outside and panicked. My only thought was to leave as quickly as possible. But before I could, David grabbed me, pulling me into his arms. Our bodies were pressed so close together. The door was still open. My heart pounded with fear. What if Mrs. Shin suddenly walked by? Let me go, I said, but my body betrayed me. No matter how much I willed it, I couldn't push him away. Say you like me too, and I'll let go. Hurry up and say it, or else Mom will come. For a second, I almost blurted it out. I like you too. David released me just before my aunt walked in. After she left, he turned to me with a smile. So, today is our first day, huh? Our first day of what? Love, he said casually, and just like that, I secretly started dating David. Cora wanted to enter the entertainment industry, so the topic of her marriage with David was never brought up again. For 2 years, we were together. And after those 2 years, David finally decided to tell his family the truth. During that time, I worked hard, so hard to be worthy of him. I achieved excellent grades, graduated with honors, and secured a job at one of the best financial firms, where I made a name for myself. But when the day of the confession arrived, I realized none of it mattered. Madame Shin's eyes held nothing but disdain. Old Master Shin's angry shouts rang in my ears. No matter how hard I worked, I still couldn't be with David. The worst part? I couldn't bring myself to go against the people who had been kind to me. In the end, all I could do was give up. Old Master Shin had David locked away and elegantly asked me to move out of the Shin family home. Madame Shin, ever composed, said, "If you want a wealthy boy, I can introduce you to one. But David, you should stay away from him." But David refused to stay locked up. He broke free and took me to a small coastal town. He loved summer. He loved the sea. He loved eating fish. We rented a tiny house, afraid of being found, afraid to touch the money in our accounts. Life was tight, and I took on odd jobs just to keep us going. It was exhausting, but it was also the happiest I had ever been. Every day, I rushed home to cook different kinds of fish for him, just because he liked it. For 6 months, he never noticed that I never ate any of it. I convinced myself it was fine. He loved me. And the fact that I didn't eat fish, it was just a small thing. It wasn't important enough for him to notice. And I still stayed by his side, happy, until the day we saw the news. Old Master Shin was seriously ill. David and I had no choice but to return. By the sea, he swore to me that no matter what happened, no matter what we faced, he would love only me. I believed him. So I transferred all my savings and assets to Mrs. Shin, far more than the money they had spent on me growing up. I wanted the right to stand as his equal. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, proving my worth would mean I could stay with David. Or at the very least, it would ease the guilt I felt for defying them. But Mrs. Shin only smiled coldly. Without us, you wouldn't even have the right to earn this money. Auntie is only worried about you, she continued smoothly. Being in my position is exhausting. And with your disability, you won't be able to control David at all. I left the Shin family feeling empty. By then, I hadn't seen David for days. I didn't know anything about old Master Shin's condition. Then, one night, I stumbled across Cora's scandal online. The man involved? David. Later, David came to see me. He got down on one knee and proposed, swearing, again, that I was the only one he loved, and I loved him. I couldn't say no. I believed in him. But then he looked at me and asked, "Why don't you eat fish? Didn't we?" He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly unsure. "David," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "do you even know what I like?" He was stunned. Scratching his head, he tried to think. "Camila, I didn't pay attention before, but now that you mention it, I can remember—" "No," I cut him off. "Let's talk about it now." He brightened. "I'll go make it for you. I've learned so many dishes just for you. When we get married, I want to cook for you every day." I lifted the plate of fish in front of me. David knelt down, reaching for a napkin to wipe my mouth, just as he always did. I didn't have to exert much effort. I simply tilted my hand and dumped the fish onto his head. The fillet slid down his face, the soup soaking his hair. David sat there, stunned, looking completely pathetic. I stared at him and asked, "Do you know why I threw up that day?" David didn't speak. He simply stood up, took a piece of tissue, and wiped the fish soup off my hands. Seeing his silence, I continued, "Because I'm pregnant. Please take me home." He turned away, muttering to himself as he grabbed something from the side. "I know," he said. "It's been 3 months. Look, I even bought clothes for the baby, the kind you like." I watched him in cold disbelief as he showed me baby products, ones eerily similar to the ones I had once picked out for my daughter. Oblivious, David kept going. "When he turns 3, he can wear this. And when he learns to read, I'll make sure. This is the first book he sees." As he continued speaking, completely lost in his own world, I couldn't hold back anymore. "I want to go home," I said firmly. He finally stopped, looking at me with a faint trace of guilt. For a moment I thought he understood, but then he smiled softly. "I'm sorry, Camila. I almost forgot." I held my breath, waiting for the words I needed to hear, but instead, he picked up a dish and placed it in front of me. Pregnant women shouldn't go hungry, and with every dish he placed on the table, he watched me carefully. As if now, after all these years, he was trying to guess what I liked, just by looking at my face. As the dishes were being served, the police arrived. On my way here, I had shared my location with Grayson, and he wasted no time in calling them. David refused to open the door, despite their warnings that if he didn't comply soon, they would use force. The commotion outside intensified when Mrs. Shen and Cora showed up. Hearing the police demand that David surrender and release the hostage for leniency, Madame Shen stepped forward, trying to downplay the situation. "It's just an emotional dispute," she insisted. Yet outside I could still hear David calling my name. "Camila, talk to the police and let them go. There's no need to make such a big fuss," she urged. The Shen family held immense power in their city. But here, in this small town, their influence barely reached. If David got caught, he would undoubtedly be investigated, held for a few days, and possibly make the news. Then, Grayson's voice rang out, firm and resolute. "Who are you to this family? To the police? This is kidnapping. My wife is pregnant." A familiar voice responded. "This gentleman, I'm Cora. I don't know if you've seen me before, but I'm an artist. I swear on my character that David is not a bad person." Something about her voice unsettled me. It had taken on an eerie, doll-like quality, sending a chill down my spine. The police ignored her, responding curtly, "Please step aside and do not interfere." David, seemingly oblivious to the chaos outside, continued serving me food. "I arranged everything overnight, all in the style you like. From now on, we'll live here. It's quiet, perfect for your pregnancy." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "David, we ended things a long time ago. There was no 5-year agreement. This is all one-sided." He shook his head, smiling as if he hadn't heard me. Then he shouted, "Camila, I don't believe you. You must still love me. You married and had a child just to provoke me, right? It's fine. I can accept it all. We love each other. Let's stop fighting and just be together." Before I could respond, the door burst open. Grayson rushed in, the police right behind him. They pinned David to the ground as my husband hurried to my side, checking me over with concern. Once he was sure I was okay, he turned to glare at David. If the police hadn't been there, I was certain Grayson would have kicked him. The police dragged David out to their patrol car as Mrs. Shen and Cora screamed his name. But David didn't even glance at them. "Let him go. Speak up. Tell them to release my son," Mrs. Shen demanded, her furious gaze locked on me. Cora clung to her arm, her expression filled with venom. "Camila, you're disgusting. The Shen family raised you for 10 years, and this is how you repay them? You're already pregnant and still seducing men? How low can you get?" It was absurd. David had tricked me into coming here, yet they were blaming me. I stayed silent, but Grayson had no such restraint. He scoffed. "That old one," he said, looking directly at Mrs. Shen. "Judging by your age, you don't have much time left, so I won't waste my breath on you. And you," he turned to Cora, "you can't even keep your own husband in check, yet you dare to scold my wife? Aren't you just jealous that she's more beautiful than you? Honestly, you look pretty pitiful. Maybe try some skincare. Get rid of those wrinkles at the corners of your eyes. Who knows? Maybe your husband will finally come home." Cora immediately started rummaging through her bag for a mirror, staring at her reflection in horror. Mrs. Shen clutched her chest, gasping. "How could you let your husband speak to me like that? Why don't you control him?" Feigning helplessness, I touched my face lightly and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Shen. I have a disability. I can't take good care of my husband." In the end, David didn't even stay in jail for 2 days before Mrs. Shen called again. This time, she spoke softly, almost pleading. Eventually, I agreed to a settlement. I never expected that David would end up in the hospital, stabbed twice and fighting for his life. I should have let him stay in jail for a few more days. The woman who attacked him had recently been released early from prison, having managed to prove she was mentally unstable. She found out David was roaming free, lay in wait near my house, and when she struck this time, she showed no mercy. The wounds were deep and precise, meant to kill. David spent days in the hospital, teetering on the edge of life and death before finally stabilizing. Then, Mrs. Shen called again. "If my son dies, your whole family will pay," she hissed. She wasn't bluffing. She had people watching my house, waiting for David's condition to worsen. I wouldn't have known if it weren't for Grayson. He found out and had people handle the situation. But I overheard everything. A few days later, Mrs. Shen's attitude suddenly changed. That evening, I went to pick up my daughter from school, only to find Mrs. Shen waiting on the stairs. Both she and her son seemed to have a strange fondness for staircases. "Camila, my good child," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, it's go see David." Right there, in the middle of the crowded hallway, she looked like she was about to kneel. Alarmed, I hurried to stop her. Not long ago, she had sworn that I would follow David to the grave. Now, she was forcing me to visit him. Did she forget her own words? Seeing the once elegant, dignified Mrs. Shen now reduced to this haggard state. I sighed and agreed. I called Grayson. As expected, he insisted on coming with me. Mrs. Shen looked like she wanted to protest, but she held back. She had no right to be picky. When we arrived at the hospital, the first thing I saw was Cora feeding David, but he wasn't eating. He just sat there, staring blankly ahead. As I stepped into the hospital room, I immediately noticed Cora stubbornly, holding a spoon near David's lips, unwilling to back down. Was this woman out of her mind? Wearing sunglasses indoors in the middle of winter? Grayson, standing beside me, couldn't help but comment on it. The moment I entered, Mrs. Shen's face lit up with excitement as she turned to her son. "David, Camila is here." David slowly turned his head toward me, his gaze scanning me, carefully. After a long moment, he finally seemed to confirm it was really me, and a brilliant smile spread across his face, so radiant that it felt strangely out of place against his frail and emaciated body. Mrs. Shen wasted no time. She strode toward Cora and pulled her up forcefully. "Get up. Let Camila sit. David doesn't want to see you." Tears streamed from beneath Cora's sunglasses. "Mom, I'm your daughter-in-law." Mrs. Shen scoffed. What kind of daughter-in-law? Prioritizes cosmetic procedures when her husband is fighting for his life? Don't think I don't know what you've been up to. Get out. Completely humiliated, Cora burst into tears and ran out of the room. Grayson, ever the sharp-tongued, one called after her. "Hey, watch out! Don't trip while wearing those sunglasses inside." Mrs. Shen gestured for me to take the seat beside David, but I shook my head, refusing. Instead, I stood near his bed, observing him quietly. She explained that ever since he had been rescued, he had refused to eat or drink, only repeating that he wanted to see me. Initially, she had resisted, threatening to keep him alive through glucose drips. But everything changed when she caught him late at night, gripping a toothbrush, trying to stab himself in the eye. She had stopped him just in time, but the look on his face had sent chills down her spine. "Mom," he had said coldly, "if I were blind and Camila was willing to be with me, would you still stop us?" Mrs. Shen trembled as she recounted this, her voice laced with fear. I exhaled slowly, meeting David's gaze. He made an attempt to sit up, but I raised my hand, signaling him to stop. Keeping my voice steady, I told him, "David, don't do this. Live well. Your life isn't just yours." Something flickered in his dark eyes, and after a long pause, he whispered, "Okay." Mrs. Shen, relieved beyond words, hurriedly ordered someone to bring food, but I had no intention of staying any longer. "Aunt Shen," I said firmly, "I've done what you asked. Please don't come looking for me again." She froze, seemingly caught off guard. Her eyes reddened. Her lips trembled as if she had more to say, but I didn't want to hear it. Any lingering feelings of past affection had already been wiped away the day she threatened my family. As I stepped out of the ward, I spotted Cora lingering in the corridor. Gone were the tears from earlier. She now looked irritated, angrily barking into her phone. Grayson leaned down and whispered, "This woman's emotions change faster than a TV drama." The moment she saw me, she stormed over, her eyes blazing. She raised her hand, as if to slap me. "I really regret not hitting you myself back then." Of course, her hand never reached me. Grayson intercepted it effortlessly. She struggled to free herself, but she was no match for him. Grayson, despite his rugged, muscular build, was always gentle with me. but not with others. I turned to him with a smile. Honey, let go. I can handle this myself. Reluctantly, he released her. The sudden loss of resistance made her stumble back, nearly losing her balance. I instinctively reached out, steadying her. Yet, even as I helped her, she sneered. Don't think flattering me now will change anything. Once she was steady, I pulled back and, without hesitation, delivered a sharp slap across her face. Loud, satisfying crack echoed down the corridor. Cora's sunglasses flew off, revealing fresh surgical scars on her eyelids. She froze, eyes wide in shock. I rubbed my palm, watching with amusement. There's an old saying. You should stand firm if you're about to get hit. Didn't anyone teach you that? Cora's face burned red with fury. You dare hit me? Do you believe I could kill you? I raised an eyebrow. A cashier has more power than the Z family's little princess? I didn't know what it was, but seeing her this enraged was oddly entertaining. Unable to contain myself, I let out a chuckle. She stomped her foot twice, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the floor. The sheer theatricality of it all made me think. If she were this good at acting, maybe people wouldn't just call her a pretty face. Cora's voice rose in hysteria. Aren't you feeling quite proud of yourself? Do you really think that just because he came to you now, it means he loves you? He just pities you, that's all. I ignored her outburst and crouched down to pick up her sunglasses. Holding them out, I smiled slightly and said, But you look quite pitiful too. Why hasn't he come out to pity you? Put them on, unless you want the reporters to catch you like this. If they do, it won't just be pitiful, it'll be downright ridiculous. I tilted my head in the direction of the entrance, where several reporters had just rushed in. The moment Cora spotted them, she instinctively reached up to cover her face and snatched for her sunglasses. But before she could take them, I pulled my hand back with a faint smirk. Oh, I forgot. Miss Cora doesn't like it when others curry favor. Then, without hesitation, I walked over to the trash can and tossed the sunglasses inside. Cora remained crouched down, too afraid to stand up and fight me for them. For years, she had built her public image as a pure, natural beauty, often criticizing young celebrities who had undergone cosmetic procedures. If the truth about her surgeries came out, even if her fans didn't abandon her completely, it would still be a huge blow to her career. All she could do now was glare at me with even more hatred. Grayson chuckled and added a casual jab. Stop staring so hard. If you keep going, that vein on your forehead is going to burst. I laughed, linking my arm with his, and then, in a deliberately loud voice, called out to the reporters, Cora is here. With that, I turned and strode away with Grayson. Outside, the snow was falling softly. Leaning against each other, we walked through the wintry streets, snowflakes drifting down onto Grayson's shoulder. A sudden warmth spread through my chest. So much had happened, yet Grayson had stayed firmly by my side, never once questioning me. As we walked, I carefully pieced together my thoughts, wondering how to tell him about my past. But before I could say anything, Grayson turned to me with an earnest look and asked, Honey, what do you want to eat tonight? I blinked. That's what you're thinking about? He nodded seriously. Yeah. Isn't this the supermarket? I was planning to stop in and buy some vegetables. I turned my head and realized we were standing outside the supermarket where I used to work. A memory resurfaced, and I asked, Hey, honey, did they ever figure out why this supermarket was losing money? I never found any clues before I got fired. Grayson smiled. I found out. Look, the employees have all changed. He explained that this supermarket was part of a chain under his family's company. For years, the accounts had shown consistent losses, but based on actual foot traffic and sales volume, it shouldn't have been in the red. Every time they asked about it, the management always had some excuse. Since we're already here, I'll look into it for a few days and figure out where the problem really lies, he said casually. I hadn't expected to get so caught up in these annoying people that I almost forgot about this issue. Half a year later, a lot had happened. I had given birth to my second child, and during this time, Cora and David had finalized their divorce. Unlike before, David had finally created his own social media account, but rather than using it to win sympathy, he was exposing Cora's lies. When CP fans flooded his comments begging for their reconciliation, David coldly responded by posting evidence that Cora had been a mistress all along. He went through her past tweets one by one, debunking her carefully crafted illusion. One of her posts read, "We went to watch a movie together today." On the same day, David had posted a picture from abroad with the caption, "Are you watching the movie from afar?" Every supposed romantic moment she had flaunted on social media was dismantled like this, piece by piece. Then, fans started begging him again, insisting, "No matter what, you love her." David's response was ruthless. "Why don't you ask Cora whose child is in her belly?" Attached to the post was a picture of 5 young male stars from the entertainment industry. The internet exploded. Cora's past scandals resurfaced: campus bullying, company tax evasion, plastic surgery. Her name shot to the top of the trending searches for all the wrong reasons. As it turned out, she was pregnant, but had desperately clung to David, hoping to give birth to the Shin family's eldest son and secure her inheritance. Unfortunately, for her, the Shin family wasn't foolish enough to fall for it. They had already conducted a thorough investigation and exposed the truth. After countless calls and messages, Cora finally responded. Her words were biting. "Is it useful to keep bothering me? Where were you all this time? You deserve for people not to want you now." The internet exploded with comments mocking her. "Cora, you lost. Even if you smash your phone into 1,000,000 pieces, it won't change the fact that you've lost everything now." Some even criticized her for insulting David, who, after stabbing himself, had sustained nerve damage that made it unlikely he'd ever walk again. Meeting David again after giving birth, I focused on my recovery. I often went to the park near my house to run. One day, after finishing my usual jog, I sat down to rest when I noticed someone standing near the stone bench I always used. It was David. He looked much thinner than before, his face pale and drawn. When he saw me approaching, he took a step forward and said, "I've been in rehabilitation for the past 6 months." He held my gaze and added, "I took your advice. I'm living well." I had expected David to come looking for me again, so it was best to make things clear once and for all. As I sat down, reaching for a cup to get some water, I suddenly realized I had forgotten to bring one. Just then, David extended his hand, holding an unopened bottle of mineral water. I didn't take it right away, but he spoke again. "Don't worry, Camila. I'm just here to apologize. If you won't even drink this, then I suppose you're still holding a grudge against me." I accepted the bottle, twisted it open, and took a couple of gulps. Looking up at him, I said calmly, "David, I used to blame you, but not anymore. And it's not because of your apology. It's for my own sake. I've moved on from this relationship. So let's not have anything to do with each other in the future, okay?" I searched his eyes, waiting for an answer, but his face blurred before me. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in that villa, lying in bed. I had been changed into pajamas, and even my phone's original case was gone. Damn it. I had been ambushed. I cursed under my breath and sighed. It really never ended. The door creaked open, and David walked in. "Get up. Dinner is ready." I glanced out the window. It was already dark. I had no idea how much time had passed. Were my children worried about me? David pulled open the wardrobe, displaying a selection of clothes. He carefully picked an outfit and placed it on the bed. "Change and come down for dinner." I grabbed the clothes and threw them at his face. The next moment, I shoved him down and began hitting him, fists landing again and again. But as I kept striking, my emotions overwhelmed me, and I started to cry. Why are you still clinging to me? Is this fun for you? You married Cora, and now that you want a divorce, you come looking for me? What do you think I am, David? He didn't resist, just endured my blows in silence. When I finally stopped, exhausted, he sat up and looked at me with an earnest expression. Camila, I only married her to inherit the family business. I have no feelings for Cora. I've always loved you. His words enraged me. Without thinking, I slapped him. Do you want me to remind you? Amusement, pity, playfulness. Oh, and compensation too. I still remembered that day vividly, the day he married Cora. Back then, I had still been foolish enough to want to reach out to him. But instead of a reply, I received a video. In the video, David was at a bar with his friends, and Cora was sitting on his lap. It was from around the time he had just returned to the Shin family, the same day rumors about him and Cora first spread. His old friends had gathered to catch up, and their conversation was all too revealing. I thought you were serious about that little blind girl. What did you even see in her? One sneered. She's nothing compared to Cora. No family background, no impressive figure. What did you even like about her? Another chimed in. David didn't respond, just let them talk. Then Cora laughed. Maybe it's because she knows how to take care of him. I heard she's been looking after him for the past 6 months. Someone scoffed. Isn't that just like falling for a nanny? David, are you really in love with a nanny? Another voice cut in. Not just that. His money's dried up for the past 6 months. David, don't tell me you were living off of her. David's expression shifted, and for a moment I thought he might finally stand up for me. Instead, he leaned in and kissed Cora in front of everyone. When he pulled away, he smirked. Come on, I was just joking. You all took it too seriously. And then he had the audacity to say, Poor thing. I blinded one of her eyes. Her family's dead, and she's so attached to me. What can I do when she clings to me like that? Why not just play along? Consider it my way of making it up to her. Everyone fell silent after that. The latter part of the video showed him and Cora growing more intimate before they left together. Now, standing before me, David stared, his face pale. Camila, I was drunk. Those words didn't mean anything. Funny, I muttered. You remember them so clearly, even though it's been 5 years. His face darkened. He had assumed I never knew the truth. Ignoring him, I walked to the door, but he grabbed me, kneeling as he slipped slippers onto my feet. Camila, the ground is cold. I kicked him away. Cleaner than your heart. Then I looked him straight in the eye and said, I'll leave you with this, David. Don't ever come looking for me again. I stepped out of the villa, still, in my pajamas, and within moments, I spotted Grayson and the police approaching. This time, there was no reconciliation. David was arrested. A few days later, he was out again. But not for long. Soon after, he was sentenced to 15 years. He had maliciously harmed someone. After his arrest, Old Master Shin brought another woman's son into the family, a clear warning to David. His position as heir wasn't guaranteed. But David no longer cared. Instead of harming himself, he went after his so-called younger brother, blinding him in both eyes. This is what you owe Camila, he had shouted. If it weren't for you, she wouldn't have been hurt. You should pay double. Old Master Shin tried to suppress the scandal, but David escaped again. The people in that video, the ones who had mocked me, didn't get off easy. Some had their bones broken, others were left paralyzed. One even had his hand crushed, ensuring he'd never use an electronic device again. As for Cora, after her family's company was investigated, they were pushed out of business. She went bankrupt, but still gave birth to her child. Paternity tests were needed because so many men had distanced themselves from her. She was mocked by the same young celebrities she once looked down upon. When she retaliated, she found herself in court, this time with no one to cover for her. On the day of David and Cora's sentencing, the internet buzzed with discussions about the infamous couple. They had both fallen, but I didn't find out until a month later. My family and I had been traveling the world, exploring breathtaking landscapes and cherishing time together. We had long left that darkness behind. One night, as our children slept, Grayson and I sat in the courtyard, gazing up at the star-filled sky. We didn't need words. Just a glance at each other was enough. Happiness flowed between us, pure and uninterrupted. If you like this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like these only at StoryTimes.